Dinner at my son's house was supposed to be ordinary. The kind of evening where conversation drifted around the table with the smell of roast chicken and laughter from the grandkids. I was halfway through my plate when my phone buzzed in my pocket. The name on the screen made my brow furrow. It was Harold, my neighbor, the kind of man who rarely called unless something was wrong. His voice, when I answered, trembled so badly I could hardly understand him at first. "Are you home?" he whispered, like a man speaking from inside a nightmare. "No," I said, my fork hovering above my plate. "Why?" There was a pause, heavy enough that I could hear my own pulse in the silence. Then Harold exhaled shakily. "Then, who's in your house right now?" The words turned my blood to ice. My chair scraped back from the table. I was already reaching for my coat when my son Gary leaned back in his seat with that mocking grin of his. "You're not going anywhere, Dad," he said, almost laughing, though his laughter didn't reach his eyes. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. He knew something. I could see it in the sharp edge of his smirk. But before I could press him, the night itself seemed to conspire against me. The door at the far end of the house slammed open with a crack so loud it made the dishes rattle on the shelves. My coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. A figure stumbled in, Gary, but not the Gary who had just laughed in my face at dinner. No, this was another night altogether. A memory carved into my bones. I remember it clearly, the night he burst into my kitchen like a storm. His leather jacket scraped against the doorframe as he stumbled forward, bloodshot eyes darting like a cornered animal. His trembling hands fumbled with the zipper of that same jacket he'd been wearing since his 20s, the one that had grown as battered and tired as he had. "Dad," he blurted, before he'd even caught his breath, "I need money." He didn't waste time with pleasantries, not even with excuses. 25,000. Tonight. The words hit me harder than his fist ever had. I set my half-empty mug down beside the stack of scattered mail on the kitchen table, my weathered hands steady only because I forced them to be. Evening light streamed through the window behind me, throwing long accusing shadows across his face. His shirt was wrinkled, untucked, and the hollows beneath his eyes told me he hadn't slept in days. 25,000, I repeated. My voice even though my stomach twisted into knots. "What kind of trouble are you in this time, son?" Gary began pacing the room like a caged wolf, his boots clicking against the hardwood in a rhythm that grew sharper with every pass. He couldn't sit still, couldn't meet my eyes. When he finally spoke, his fist came down on the table so hard the salt shaker leapt into the air. "It's complicated. Some business deal went wrong. I need to make it right, fast." "Business deal," I echoed, keeping my jaw tight. "Or gambling debt." His face flushed scarlet. He spun on me, blocking the kitchen entrance with his broad shoulders. "It's not your business what it is. I just need the money. And I know you have it. From selling the farm." The farm. 3 generations of Porter's sweat and blood, gone last year so I could finally retire. The money was meant to carry me through my final years with dignity, not disappear into some backroom casino because my 38-year-old son had once again lost control. "How much do you owe them, Gary?" I asked quietly. "Them?" His voice cracked on the word. His hands shook as he ran them through greasy hair, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The people who sent you here," I pressed. "The ones who have you shaking like a leaf. The ones who don't wait around for payment plans." "Dad, please." His voice broke into a plea, but his eyes were frantic. "You don't understand. These aren't people you say no to." I had heard this song before. Last year it was 12,000 for a sure thing at the track. The year before, 8,000 for poker debts. Every time, he swore it was the last. Every time, I bailed him out. Every time, I believed his empty promises. But not this time. I straightened my shoulders and locked my gaze on his. "No, son, not this time." His face drained of color, then flared red with rage. "What do you mean not this time? I'm your son." "Which is exactly why I'm saying no," I replied, turning my back on him deliberately as I walked to the sink. My voice was hard now, edged with years of disappointment. Every dollar I've ever given you has vanished into some slot machine or poker game. I won't enable it anymore. Enable, he spat, the word bursting from his mouth like a curse. I'm asking my father for help, and you call it enabling. I call it what it is. I gripped the counter, staring at the darkened window above the sink. You're 38 years old, Gary. When are you going to stop running to me every time you ruin your own life? For a long moment, he just stood there, chest heaving, face twisted, and then his expression shifted, and what crept into his eyes froze me to my core, cold, cruel, a menace I had never seen in my son before. You'll regret this, old man, he whispered, his voice low and venomous. You think you're so high and mighty, sitting on that farm money while your own son drowns. Maybe it's time someone taught you what real trouble looks like. Before I could respond, he stormed out, his boots pounding against the floorboards like war drums. The screen door slammed, rattling the house to its bones. Through the window, I watched his battered pickup truck roar to life and vanish down the gravel road, its red tail lights fading into the darkness. The silence afterward was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas and the uneasy groan of the old house around me. His threat, "You'll regret this, old man," echoed in my mind long after the night had swallowed him. That weekend, I buried myself in chores to keep from replaying the confrontation. Yard work, fixing the fence line, clearing leaves. But every time I passed the kitchen doorway, I could still hear his voice, could still feel that chill in his eyes. By Monday morning, I sat in my favorite armchair, a cold cup of coffee, abandoned on the side table. At exactly 10:15, the rotary phone rang, its shrill tone stabbing through the stillness. I picked it up with dread in my chest. "Hello, Dad," Gary said, but his voice was different this time, softer, almost cheerful, like the boy he used to be. I wanted to call and apologize. For the other night, I was way out of line. In 38 years my son had never apologized for anything without being cornered into it. My grip tightened on the receiver. "Really?" I muttered. "That's unexpected." I know," he said quickly, almost laughing, but it was a laugh that sounded rehearsed, as if read from a script. "I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. I can't keep coming to you. It's not fair. I need to stand on my own." I glanced at the mantel where old photographs of him as a child stared back at me, fireflies in jars and smiles that hadn't yet soured. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. "This time will be different," Gary promised. "I swear it. That's why I'm calling. Hetty and I want to have you over for dinner Wednesday night. She's making that pot roast you love, with little potatoes. 6:30, at the new place, 142 Maple Street, blue house, white shutters, right across from the school." He rattled off the address too smoothly, without pause, like he'd memorized it, like he was reading from a piece of paper. I scribbled it on a napkin, my pen hovering uneasily. "Hetty's excited," he continued. "She keeps talking about how we need to be a real family again. You know how she is about family traditions." That much was true. Hetty was always the one to keep things stitched together. It was one of the reasons I respected her. "Well," I said slowly, staring at the address written in shaky ink, "I suppose I could come by." "Great. That's great, Dad." He sounded almost relieved. "Thanks for giving me another chance. I know I don't deserve it." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there for a long time, listening to the dial tone, staring at the napkin in my hand. Something about that call gnawed at me. The practiced tone, the quick directions, the sudden warmth in his voice. But maybe it wasn't all bad. Maybe he was trying. Maybe Hetty had finally gotten through to him. Still, 142 Maple Street. The numbers pressed down on me like a stone. That night, I lay in bed fully dressed, except for my shoes, the ceiling fan casting restless shadows on the walls. My eyes kept drifting to the clock. 10:47, 11:23. 11:58, each minute dragged like an eternity, and sleep would not come. Before 10 months, because in my gut I knew Wednesday night would change everything. Sleep wouldn't come. Each time my eyes closed, I didn't hear the warmth in Gary's voice from yesterday's phone call. Instead, I saw his face from Friday night. That cold mask, the stranger who'd stood in my kitchen and threatened me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle. The son I had raised, the boy I remembered, would never have looked at me that way. But then again, the son I had raised would never have asked me for $25,000, cash, to pay off loan sharks either. The memory dragged me back to other nights, the worst kind of nights. I thought about the time he'd called me from a casino at 2 in the morning, his words slurred and jagged, drowning in whiskey. "Dad, I need a ride. My truck won't start." I had found him stumbling across the parking lot, broke, empty-eyed, stripped of every dollar and every ounce of pride. He'd collapsed into my passenger seat and fallen asleep before we even left the lot, snoring like the little boy who used to drift off on long drives to his grandmother's house. It was impossible not to remember that little boy, the boy who had spent entire summers in my garage, handing me wrenches and asking endless questions about engines and carburetors. The teenager who had raced into the house one afternoon, face lit up, waving his first paycheck from the hardware store like a golden ticket. The young man who had once sworn to me that he would build a better life, something larger than this small town and its shadows. When had that boy disappeared? At what exact moment had he slipped away, leaving me with this desperate gambling man who could stare into his own father's eyes and whisper a threat? I pushed myself up from the bed, restless, and crossed to the window. The street below was empty now, though in my mind I still saw the red glow of his taillights disappearing into the night 3 days ago. The pavement gleamed faintly beneath the corner street lamp. I stood there, staring into the stillness, and I felt it in my bones, the way an old farmer knows when the air is shifting and a storm is coming. Somewhere out there Gary was planning something, and yet, maybe I was wrong. Maybe the voice on the phone yesterday had been real. Maybe Hetty had gotten through to him. She was steady, grounded, practical in ways my son had never learned to be. If anyone could pull him back from the edge, it would be her. I returned to the bed and picked up the photograph from my nightstand. Gary at 12 years old, grinning wide and gap-toothed beside the go-kart we had built together. His hands were black with grease, his hair wild, and his eyes, God, those eyes, sparkled with the pure joy of building something with his own 2 hands. That boy had believed anything was possible if you worked hard enough. Maybe some part of that boy was still alive, buried somewhere inside the desperate man who had stood in my kitchen. Maybe Wednesday night's dinner would be the first step toward finding him again. The clock read 12:34 when my eyelids finally grew heavy. I clutched the frame to my chest and let myself sink toward sleep, though unease gnawed at me in the shadows. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but sometimes trust is all a father has left. Sometimes you have to try. Tuesday morning found me at the kitchen sink, coffee mug in hand, staring through the window at the street outside. Sleep had been patchy, a few broken hours at best. My mind kept circling back to Gary's words, his tone, his forced cheerfulness on the phone. For every flicker of hope, another part of me whispered caution. Was it genuine, or was it practiced? That's when I noticed it. The truck. It wasn't familiar. Parked across from Mrs. Henderson's mailbox, angled just enough to have a perfect view of my driveway. I remembered seeing it the night before when I brought in the garbage cans, but I'd written it off as a visitor. Now, with morning sunlight glinting off the dew clinging to its windshield, the sight unsettled me. Through the driver's side window, I could make out a figure hunched forward over the wheel. His fingers tapped nervously on the dashboard, an erratic rhythm that didn't belong to a man simply waiting out car trouble. Every few seconds, he lifted his head, scanning the street as though searching for something or someone. I set my coffee down slowly, the ceramic clinking against the counter, and stepped outside. My boots crunched over the gravel of my driveway, loud in the stillness of the morning. The air was crisp, filled with the distant hum of the highway and the birds beginning their chatter in the hedges. As I approached the truck, the figure inside stiffened. He was middle-aged, maybe pushing 50, with thinning hair slicked back in a way that made his pale skin look even more bloodless. His posture was tight, coiled like a rabbit caught in a snare. I rapped my knuckles gently against the driver's window. He jumped, visibly startled, then rolled the glass down with a squeal that matched the tension in his face. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice light, friendly, neighborly. "Everything okay?" I noticed you've been parked here since yesterday. The man's eyes, bloodshot and jittery, flicked everywhere but at me. His voice came out a touch too high. Oh yes, sir, everything's fine. He coughed and forced a smile. Just, having some engine trouble. Letting her cool down before I give her another try. I nodded slowly, though my eyes drifted to the Virginia plates on his bumper. Strange, a man with engine trouble. Stranded overnight, hundreds of miles from home, in my quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood, and parked right where he could watch my house. The knot in my gut tightened. Gary's words hung in the air, and for a moment the flickering candlelight seemed to draw shadows across his face, softening the forced brightness of his grin. I raised my glass slowly, clinking it against his and Hetty's with the practiced ease of someone who knew when to play along, though my eyes never left his wrist. Every time the stem of the glass touched his lips, his gaze slid to that watch again, quick furtive checks as though he was waiting for something timed down to the minute. Hetty's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her own glass, knuckles pale as she gripped the stem too tightly, and she drained half the wine in one go. The food on the table smelled rich and inviting, the kind of meal that should have eased every worry from my mind, but instead it seemed too polished, too deliberate, as if each dish had been placed there not for us to eat, but for me to see. Conversation skated on the surface of things. Gary talking about home renovations, Hetty complimenting the cut of my suit, but beneath it all I felt the weight of something rehearsed, a script being followed word for word. Between bites of steak I found myself remembering that unfamiliar truck from Tuesday morning, the man's jittery excuses about carburetors and cooling engines, the way he had looked at my house like it contained something he needed. My fork paused midway to my mouth. Could it be connected? The thought lodged in my chest like a splinter. And for the rest of the meal, every glance Gary stole at his watch, every nervous flutter of Hetty's hands, every gleam of the perfectly set table seemed less like coincidence, and more like a pattern I wasn't meant to see until it was too late. I forced a smile, chewing slowly, tasting not just the food but the unease rising in me, and wondered what exactly was supposed to happen when that watch struck whatever hour Gary was waiting for. Hold on there, Dad. You're getting all worked up over nothing. Gary's voice trembled at the edges too loud for the room, and the laugh that followed sounded like someone trying to force sunshine through a cracked window. I felt his hand on my sleeve, an awkward, almost pleading touch, as if he could push me back into the role he'd rehearsed for me all evening. Grateful, forgiving, easily led. Elmer's 72. The man can't see his own hand at night. He's probably looking at shadows. Hetty's face had gone the color of porcelain. She set down the last dish as if she'd been holding it for a decade, knuckles white around the rim. Maybe he did see something, she whispered, not trusting the syllables that would follow. Her voice didn't match her eyes. They were full of the same fear I'd seen in the truck driver's face that morning. I looked at them, the two people who'd put on a show all evening, whose smiles had been a little too bright, whose small gestures had been rehearsed down to the last napkin fold, and something cold slid into me. For a dizzy second, I felt the years peel away and the old instincts take over. The farmer who could read the weather by the smell in the air, the man who knew when the cattle were anxious before the storm hit. This was wrong. The timing was wrong. The truck that had watched my house, the nervous man with Virginia plates, it fit together like the first two pieces of a puzzle you didn't want to see completed. No, I said, slow and steady. I'm going home. I stepped past Gary's hand and toward the door. Gary moved faster than I expected, and planted himself in the doorway, blocking my path. Up close, I saw sweat on his lip, saw the tremor in his jaw. Dad, he started, but the plea was thin. Please, let's just call Elmer back. Ask him again. Maybe he didn't mean up inside. Maybe he saw reflections. Reflections, I barked, the word stripped of patience. When did reflections start climbing upstairs and clearing out into bedrooms? Hetty's hands flew to her mouth. Whatever plan they had, whatever they were trying to time, was slipping. Gary's eyes flicked to the watch again. The movement was automatic, a nervous habit that betrayed more than his smile ever would. He'd been watching the clock all night like a man waiting for a signal. Call the police then, I said. Tell them Elmer saw flashlight beams in my house an hour ago. Tell them to send someone now. He put a hand on my shoulder, too firm to be gentle. Dad, that will ruin everything. We can handle this ourselves. Please, just sit, eat. Don't make a scene. Someone's rifling through my life while I sit at your table and listen to rehearsed apologies, I said. I won't wait for them to finish. His face went hard, like someone watching a tide roll in, and realizing a plan was about to be swept away. If you call the police, they'll see how unstable you are, he hissed. He swallowed. I'd never seen him so exposed, so raw with a fear that bordered on fury. For a moment, our small dining room felt like a stage again. But the script had fallen out of the actor's hands. I reached for my keys. I'm not staying. I picked up the phone on the side table and dialed 911 with hands that had steadied into businesslike efficiency, despite the tremor under my skin. I told them Elmer had called, that lights were moving through my house, that I was on my way, and believed someone might still be inside. The operator's voice was calm, professional. We'll send a squad car out right away, sir. Stay on the line if you can. I promised I would, and I slammed the receiver back into its cradle with a little more force than necessary. Gary lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. You don't need to go, he said. The fingers around my arm were warm and real. For half a breath, I saw the son I'd known. The kid who'd once asked me for pennies to buy comic books. Then his eyes slid away and he said, if you go, you'll only make it worse. If I don't go, I said, looking at him, and something's stolen. Or worse. How do I sleep knowing I didn't at least try? Hetty stepped between us, the tension in her hands visible as she smoothed her apron. Please, Wilbur, she said softly. We'll call the police too. Let's just wait for them. I could see the tremor in her voice, the way her shoulders rose with each shallow breath. She wanted the same thing I did to stop a plan from collapsing into real violence. Whether she realized what the plan was, I couldn't tell. I pulled my arm free and left before Gary could protest further. At the porch, the night air hit me like a slap, sharp and clean and full of the smell of cut grass and distant rain. The moon had just climbed above the tree line, thin and watchful. I walked to my truck and slid behind the wheel with movements that had been practiced through decades of driving to market, to emergencies, to midnight calls. I glanced in the rear view and saw Gary stand framed in the doorway, his shoulders hunched, his face lit by the kitchen light. Hetty hovered by his side like a question. As I pulled out, my headlights caught the shine of something parked across the street. There it was, again, the unfamiliar truck, engine idling, parked in the same spot across from Mrs. Henderson's mailbox. My breath caught. The license plate, JKL 4729, was stamped into my memory like a brand. The truck's driver sat hunched over the wheel, as if in a prayer or a fit. For a second he looked up, and our eyes met in the passing glare. He smiled. No, not a smile, an attempt at composure, and then turned his gaze back to my driveway. I slowed, not wanting to show obvious interest, and rolled the window down a crack. The sound of gravel under my tires was a small private thing, an old man's metronome. The man in the truck watched me like a man waiting for permission. I felt the weight of a history I had never asked for. The farm sold, the money tucked away in safer places, years of trust invested, and now apparently being cashed in on deceit. My phone buzzed again. Elmer had called back. His voice was ragged with worry. They're at the back door, Wilbur. 2 of them. I can see beams down near the kitchen. They're wearing dark clothes. I don't want to call myself. He sounded old suddenly, small. I'll stay here. I'll watch. Help is on the way, I told him. And mind your curtains. Don't go outside. I cut the engine and killed the lights, sitting in the dark, as if becoming one with the night might make me invisible. The truck across the street remained a shadowy block. Every instinct I had told me to wait, let the police do their work. But another part of me, as stubborn and tired as the fields I once plowed, felt the pull of something older. You do not stand by and watch your life be taken. I eased my hand into the glove compartment and ran my fingers over a folded photograph. Gary at 12, gap-toothed and proud beside the go-kart. The image steadied me. Rage and love braided together, hot and cold. If this was a play, if they had set a scene to get me out of the house, then I would not be the simple, gullible audience. I would watch the stage, learn the actors' tells, and when the curtain fell, I would be ready. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The truck's passenger door opened, and a pair of boots touched the gravel. Two figures slipped into the hedgerow behind the mailbox. A choreography of shadow and intent. My pulse hammered, not with fear now, but with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who has farmed enough seasons to read the beginning of trouble when it unfurls. The street remained quiet except for the distant hum of the highway and the little jitter of cicadas. My headlights picked out the sheen of wet leaves. I thought of the farm money, of every careful decision I had made to protect my final years, of every promise and every broken one. The night felt suddenly thin. A sheet stretched over a pit. When the first patrol car slid up the street, lights painting the trees in blue and red, the two shadowed figures froze. I watched Gary in my mind's eye, the practiced smiles, the watch checks, the too perfect dinner, and I knew, with the slow, terrible clarity that comes before action, that this was no ordinary theft. Whatever game they'd set, it had rules, and I had just learned them. I sat very still and listened as the officer called out, voice authoritative and steady, "Police, come out with your hands up." A rustle in the hedgerow answered him. Boots on gravel. A corner of a jacket flashed. For the first time that night, something in me didn't want to be the surprised man at the end of a scheme. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to catch the players mid-act. When the police lights painted the blue and the red across Gary's porch, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with survival. But deeper than that, a darker feeling threaded through me, part fear, part resolve. I had been warned. The son who'd threatened me in my kitchen had meant it. The night was far from over. "Move aside, Gary." I kept my voice even, the kind of tone I'd used when the cattle needed calming before a thunderstorm. I could feel my pulse under my throat, but I refused to let it speed up. He wouldn't win that way. He planted himself more deliberately between me and the door, hands heavy on my shoulders. Up close I could see the sweat at his hairline, the tremor that ran through his fingers like electricity. "Think about it logically," he said, as if the two of us were solving a math problem and not standing in the center of a lie. If someone was really robbing houses, wouldn't they pick a time when people aren't having dinner? Wouldn't they case the place first? The explanation was precise, too precise. It fit too neatly into the small holes I'd already noticed. The truck across the street, the jittery man, Hetty's tremulous hands. Logic, he offered. Strategy, like a chess player trying to convince me he was merely moving pieces on a board. I stared at him until the words fell away. "How do you know that?" I demanded before I could swallow it. The question sounded weak in my own ears, but it made his face tighten immediately, a micro-expression of panic that lasted only the briefest of breaths, and then flared into something else, anger quickly covered over with practiced concern. He tightened his grip, making the skin along my forearm crease. "Dad, please, let's just finish dinner and then we'll go together. I'll drive. We'll check everything out." Calmly. Behind him, Hetty'd gone still as a photograph, a dish towel clutched in hands gone white. When our eyes met, she looked away like someone caught without a script. There was guilt written plain across her features, a confession worn on the very lines of her face. For a second I saw through them both. Not the family I wanted, but two actors who had rehearsed this scene until the edges had been sanded down to lie flat. "Get out of my way, son." The words came out harder than I expected, weighted with the authority I'd used for years to stop fights, to call harvesters in from fields, to set boundaries no one dared cross. It snapped something inside him. He flushed red, breath quick, jaw working. "You will step aside and let me leave this house right now," I said, forcing each syllable into a command. "Or what? You'll call the cops on your own father?" His voice dropped. There was a dangerous edge to it I'd never heard. "You'll destroy our family over some old man's paranoid fantasies." He breathed hard. The wine on his breath was bitter against the sweetness of the candles. Even as he spoke, his eyes flicked to the door, to his wristwatch, then to Hetty, The quick, nervous checks of a man measuring time against a plan. It was the kind of habit you develop when you've synchronized moves with others. It wasn't paranoid if someone was actually rifling through my house. I took a step forward. He stepped with me, closing the distance until we were face to face. "If you don't let me pass," I said, voice low now, "I'm going to start wondering why my own son is so determined to keep me away from my home on the exact night someone decides to rob it." The words hung in the air like a thrown stone. His hands jerked. Shock flickered across his face. Then guilt. Then fury. Finally resignation. A look that said the script had slipped, and the improvisation had begun. Maybe he realized the game had changed. His reaction was a swift, sharp thing. He reached up, thumbed the deadbolt, and the lock clicked in a metallic punctuation that echoed tight and awful through the hallway. He slid the key into his pocket with an exaggerated slowness, as if to make the point that I was, quite literally, being kept inside. "You're not leaving, Dad, not until we figure this out." His voice was flat and final. For a moment I thought about the old ways, pushing him aside and forcing my way through. I pictured the table overturned, the dinner left to chaos, the neighbors' curtains drawn like shutters on a storm. But there's a cunning that comes with age. You learn how to use other people's impatience and rules against them. I weighed my options in a heartbeat, and chose the one that would reveal more than it would break. I smiled, the kind of small, sad smile that hides a plan and makes people misread you as resigned. "All right," I said, "we'll figure this out together. I've already called the police." The words landed between us like a cold, wet cloth. His hand tightened on my shoulder the way a man grips a rope. "You what?" The crack in his voice was thin. "I called them as soon as Elmer rang," I said. "They're on their way. I told them there were people with flashlights moving through my house. They're coming now." I watched the color drain out of his face in stages. First his cheek, then his lips, then the whites of his eyes. He exchanged a glance with Hetty, and for the first time all night there was no practiced expression to hide behind. He tried to argue, something about ruining everything, about how a scene with police would tear our family apart. He sounded like a man trying to hold together a paper boat against a river of truth. Behind him Hetty swayed slightly, hands fluttering like a trapped bird. The guilt in her eyes had become a small exposed thing. "You won't go," Gary hissed at last, voice clipped. "You're not going to make this worse." "Worse?" I repeated. "If someone is in my house, the worst thing I can do is wait until they leave with everything I own. The worst thing I can do is trust the performance and let them take what I've worked for." I put as much of my heart into each word as a farmer puts into stacking hay, deliberate, heavy with care. He stepped in front of me again, but this time his strength looked thinner, like a man wearing costume armor. "If you go out there now," he said desperately, "they'll call it a trap. They'll then let them be trapped," I said. "There's a difference between a trap for thieves and letting your son scheme to steal from his own father." My voice was soft, but it carried the finality of harvest. He stared at me, eyes wide now, no longer pretending. Hetty's face had gone as pale as the china they'd laid out, and her fingers dug into the towel until the fabric creased. The distance between them and the life I'd imagined closed in like a door. Whatever plan they'd set in motion, whatever callous calculation had sent a truck to sit across the street and a nervous man to drum his fingers while watching my windows had misjudged one thing: the stubbornness of a man who knows what his hands have built and will not stand aside while it is taken. The first siren was faint, a thin blue thread in the night that grew and braided itself into the air. Gary's face crumpled. He dropped his hands. Then, as if the motion of surrender had been rehearsed too, Hetty let out a small sound, a mixture of relief and fear. My chest loosened, but not with triumph, with a grief that folded in on itself. The son who had threatened me weeks ago had been the same son who would stand in my doorway that night, caught between greed and fear. When the patrol car's lights painted the hallway in frantic strips of blue and red, when officers called out and footsteps pounded the porch, the lock on the door was still warm from where Gary had turned it. I stepped past him, not because I had to assert authority, but because something older than pride was steering me, the need to see with my own eyes what had become of our family. Outside, under the police lights, the night opened up. The truck across the street sat shadow still, neighbors leaned from windows, the actors' masks slipped, and in their places I saw not villains in a movie but human faces, worn and flattened by choices. I had wanted for so long a simple reconciliation. Instead I had a reckoning. The officers moved quickly, professional and steady. They found the figures in the hedgerow and the shed where someone had tried to stash things. They took statements. They read rights in a voice that made the world feel smaller and kinder at once. Gary and Hetty stood at my back on the porch, hands limp at their sides, their scripts blown apart by the intrusion of law and light. I watched them being led away and felt a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. My hands, those same hands that had tightened bolts, calmed frightened horses, and planted rows of corn, shook as I gripped the countertop. The house around me felt both betrayed and relieved, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. When the constable asked if I wanted to press charges, the room tilted. I thought of the farm money, of the years of small savings tucked away for a quiet finish to a long life. I thought of the boy with grease on his hands and the man with wine on his breath. I want them to answer for what they did, I heard myself say, and the voice that came back was not cruel. It was simply a man setting things right. The night had been built for a confession. The confession had arrived. The lock's echo still reverberated in my chest, sharper than any blade could have been. The words, "You're not leaving, Dad," carried a menace my son had never possessed as a child. I stared at him, at Gary, though the name no longer fit the stranger standing before me, and felt something icy settle deep inside me. This was not the boy who once begged for a quarter to buy baseball cards, or the teenager who had sworn he'd never touch a drop of liquor after his first hangover. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man willing to cage his own father like an animal, while accomplices looted the house I had built with my hands. "Gary!" My voice was steady, though my pulse rattled so hard it seemed to shake my ribs. "Unlock that door right now." "I can't do that." His reply was calm, almost bored, as he leaned his full weight against the door, arms crossed like a guard posted at a prison gate. The mask of concern had slipped entirely. He no longer bothered pretending. "Not until you calm down. Not until you listen to reason." Behind him, poor Hetty pressed herself against the dining room wall, a dish towel still twisted between her fists like a rope. The horror on her face was different from mine, not disbelief, but dawning recognition, as though she too was realizing she no longer knew the man she had married. "Listen to reason." I forced my tone level, though every nerve screamed at me to break his grip, to shove past him and run until the cold air hit my lungs. "Son, you just locked me inside your house against my will while someone robs mine. Tell me what possible reason justifies that." Gary's expression hardened into something dangerous, his eyes narrowing with a knowledge I wasn't meant to share. "You don't understand the situation you're in," he said, voice low, each syllable clipped. "There are people involved in this that you don't want to cross. People who don't forgive debts. People who don't accept excuses." The admission struck me like a hammer blow to the sternum. Not only had Gary orchestrated this, but he was willing to feed me to wolves to cover his own sins. The image of him 5 days earlier, begging for 25,000, swearing I'd regret saying no, flashed through my mind with cruel clarity. Now I understood. This wasn't about desperation anymore. This was calculation, and the cold look in his eyes as he said it left no doubt. He'd chosen his side. I let silence stretch between us, let him believe I was beaten. Then I said, softly, "I need to use the bathroom." Suspicion flared in his expression. His jaw worked. His eyes flicked over my face, searching for deceit, but something deeper, some shred of decency, or perhaps just the echo of the upbringing I had tried to give him, stayed his hand. He gave a short nod. "Fine, but don't try anything stupid." The hallway seemed to pulse with tension as I walked down it, their eyes boring into my back. The bathroom door closed with a muted click, and immediately their whispers filled the space outside, urgent, frantic, indecipherable, but I didn't need words to know panic when I heard it. I turned toward the window, my one chance. I remembered it from past visits. A single pane facing the backyard, a flimsy latch that had resisted no one but the weather. My fingers trembled as I worked it, but years of paint buildup yielded at last, and the old wood creaked open on rusted hinges. The screen was brittle, almost brittle enough to crumble, and it came free with hardly a sound. The night air hit me cold and clean. Below was Hetty's flower bed, soft earth and thorny branches waiting 6 feet down. For a man of 68, it was no easy task. My joints screamed at the thought, my back already tight from the long dinner chair. But desperation lends a man both strength and courage he didn't know remained in him. I squeezed through the narrow frame, grunting with effort, my jacket snagging on the sill. My body felt ungainly, stiff, a far cry from the man who once vaulted fences in his youth. But inch by inch I pushed through, teeth gritted, until gravity pulled me free. I landed hard in the garden, knees buckling, dirt exploding against my trousers. Pain flared sharp in my joints, and for a moment I feared something had snapped. But when I pushed myself up, breath rasping, I realized it was only the ache of old bones meeting the earth too suddenly. The soil was damp, clinging to my palms and knees, the smell of crushed flowers sharp in my nose. Branches tore at my jacket, leaving ragged scratches across the fabric. I stood there in the darkness, heart thundering, staring at the back of Gary's house, the house that now felt less like my son's home, and more like a cage I had barely escaped. But beyond that house, across the dark stretch of yard and street, was my home, my sanctuary, and someone was inside it. Behind me, muffled through the bathroom door I'd slipped out of, Gary's voice grew sharper, louder, agitated. He would find the empty room soon. He would see the open window, the torn screen, the bent latch. How long until he realized? How long until his carefully constructed play fell apart? My car sat where I'd left it in their driveway, a beacon of escape. My hands trembled as I shoved the key into the ignition, but the engine turned over smooth as ever, its familiar hum a lifeline. I backed out slowly, not daring to draw attention, not wanting any curious neighbor to peek out and wonder why Wilbur Porter was tearing away from his son's home at such an odd hour. It wasn't until I'd cleared 3 blocks that the weight of what had happened settled fully upon me. My own son had betrayed me, not in the simple way of white lies or failed promises, not in the disappointing way of squandered potential. No, this betrayal had teeth. He had orchestrated a crime against me, lured me into his house with false warmth and hollow apologies, kept me prisoner with cheap sentiment, while strangers tore through the rooms I'd built, the life I'd built. And Hetty, her nervous smile, her restless hands, she had been part of the theater too. The streets blurred around me, familiar landmarks passing unnoticed as anger, betrayal, and grief wrestled inside my chest. Grief most of all, the grief of a father forced to admit that the son he thought he knew had long since disappeared. But beneath that grief, colder and sharper, was determination. Gary had inherited my eyes, my stubborn streak, my temper, but he had underestimated the steel in me. 40 years of working with my hands, negotiating with hard men, solving problems others thought impossible, those lessons hadn't left me, and now they would be turned against the very boy who had thought his father too old, too soft to fight back. When I turned onto my street, the truth awaited me in a wash of red and blue. Police lights flashed against the siding of homes I'd lived beside for decades, painting the night in alternating warning. My heart sank as I saw the cluster of patrol cars parked in front of my house. The scene looked staged for television, officers moving with clipped precision, radios squawking, neighbors gathered at the fringes, their faces alight with morbid curiosity. I parked behind the last cruiser and climbed out, my legs unsteady but moving fast. At my front walk, Officer Ted Miller intercepted me with calm professionalism, clipboard tucked under one arm. "Mr. Porter, glad you're here. We've got your burglar in custody. Your neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, has been an enormous help." Relief slipped from me in a sigh I hadn't realized I was holding. Elmer was right. I looked across the street where Elmer stood by his fence, arms folded, pride written clear on his face. His instincts had been vindicated. My instincts too. Someone really was in my house. Yes, sir. We caught him in your basement. He was attempting to break into what appears to be a safe. Miller's tone dropped as he added, "He's already confessed to breaking and entering. And he's told us something else you should hear." He guided me toward a cruiser. Through the reinforced glass of the back window, I saw the burglar, thin, pale, early 40s. His shoulders slumped, wrists chained. Recognition struck at once. I had spoken to this man yesterday. I remembered his twitching hands, his claim of car trouble, near Mrs. Henderson's mailbox. I had believed him then. "His name is Otis Raines," Miller said. "Ring any bells?" "I spoke to him yesterday," I murmured, voice distant, disbelieving. "He said his truck had broken down." "I thought he was just nervous." "He was nervous," Miller agreed grimly, "but not because of a broken truck. He was hired to commit this burglary, hired by your son, Mr. Porter." The words landed like a hammer blow, though some corner of me had braced for it. My chest still tightened as if Miller had struck me. Gary hired him to rob my house while I was at dinner." The words came flat, emptied of all emotion. "That's what Raines says. He claims your son promised him $5,000 to break into your safe. Said the dinner invitation was all part of the plan." I moved closer to the cruiser, staring at Raines until his eyes lifted reluctantly to meet mine. I saw no remorse there, only fear at being caught, shame at having failed. "Did you get into the safe?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "No, sir," Miller said. The basement door slowed him down. By the time he forced it, Jenkins had already called us. "He tried, though. Tool marks. Crowbar, drill, you'll see." And see I did. Down in my basement, my father's old Mosler stood like a sentinel, battered but unbroken, the gouges on its surface proof of Otis's desperation. Tools littered the floor like discarded weapons. 40 years it had guarded my savings, my papers, my history, and tonight it had guarded my dignity as well. Back upstairs, Elmer joined me. His handshake was firm, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man proven right. "I told you that truck didn't belong. Been watching him since Tuesday. Too nervous, too interested in your place." "You saved me, Elmer," I admitted quietly, eyes burning. "You saved everything." He shook his head. "Any good neighbor would have done the same. Important thing now is making sure this doesn't happen again." Before I could reply, Officer Miller returned, his face grim, his words heavier than the badge he wore. "Mr. Porter, we're heading to your son's residence now. With the confession and the evidence, we have enough to charge him with conspiracy to commit burglary, among other crimes." He paused, studying me with something like pity. "I need to ask, do you want to press full charges against your son?" The night seemed to still around me. The sirens quieted. The chatter of officers dimmed. The whispers of neighbors faded. All that remained was the question, heavy as stone. Would I condemn my own flesh and blood, or would I let betrayal slide, knowing he had tried to destroy me for his own gain? And in that silence, I realized this was no longer about Gary's choices, it was about mine. The silence that settled over the neighborhood, after the last patrol car turned the corner, felt unnatural, heavy, as though even the night itself had paused to absorb what had just unfolded. I sat there in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the empty street where my son had just been taken away in handcuffs. For years I had told myself that Gary's worst impulses, his lies, his gambling, his arrogance, were just phases, rough patches he'd grow out of, if given enough time, enough support, enough chances. Tonight had ripped away that illusion like a mask torn from an actor's face. No more excuses. No more rationalizations. My son wasn't just lost. He had crossed into something darker, something I couldn't follow him into, and something I could never forgive. I looked up and saw Hetty, still standing in the doorway of her house, framed by the yellow glow of the porch light. She looked hollow, like a woman who had aged a decade in a single night. Her hands clutched the doorframe for balance, and for a moment I wondered if she might collapse right there on the porch. Our eyes met across the street. I wanted to hate her for being part of Gary's deception, for smiling at me over dinner, while she knew full well that strangers were breaking into my home. But in that moment, I saw something else in her expression, relief perhaps, or resignation. The look of someone who had finally spoken the truth, after too long living with lies. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before retreating inside and closing the door, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When I finally drove back home, the house looked unchanged from the outside. Same neat lawn, same front steps I'd walked up 1,000 times. But as I stepped through the door, escorted earlier by officers who had cleared the scene, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The air smelled faintly of sweat and metal, remnants of Otis's failed attempt on the safe, scuff marks on the basement door, footprints in the hallway carpet, little scars of intrusion that no amount of cleaning would ever fully erase. My house had held firm, but the real damage wasn't to wood or steel, it was to trust, to family, to the fragile belief that blood somehow meant loyalty. I walked down to the basement alone, each step creaking under the weight of my anger. The old Mosler safe stood exactly where it had always been, solid and unbroken, just as my father had left it. The crowbar and drill lay scattered on the floor, mute reminders of Gary's betrayal. I knelt beside the safe, running my hand across the cool steel, and for the first time that night, tears threatened to come. This safe had survived decades, had withstood the desperate violence of a petty thief. My family had not. Back upstairs I poured myself a glass of bourbon, the kind I usually saved for Christmas or birthdays, and sat in the darkened living room. Every corner of the house carried a memory. Gary as a boy building forts with couch cushions, birthday candles blown out at the dining table, arguments and laughter, and the small triumphs that make up a family's life. Tonight, all those memories felt poisoned, tainted by what my son had chosen to do. The boy I'd raised was gone, and in his place was a man who saw me, not as a father, but as an obstacle, a vault, a means to settle his debts. And yet, beneath the grief, beneath the ache in my chest, there was a new current, steady and unyielding. Gary thought tonight was the end of my control, the night he'd finally get what he wanted. He was wrong. Tonight wasn't the end, it was the beginning. He'd underestimated me once, and it had cost him his freedom. But this wasn't finished. The people Gary was afraid of, the ones he had borrowed from, the ones he claimed would come looking for payment, they were still out there. If Gary had dragged me into his mess, then I intended to make sure I was the one who walked away clean. As the bourbon burned down my throat, I set the glass aside and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the neighborhood was silent again, but inside me, something colder had settled into place. My son had chosen his path. Now I would choose mine. And I knew one thing with absolute clarity: the story of Gary's betrayal wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. But for the Porter family, nothing would ever be normal again. 2 days had passed since the arrests, and Friday afternoon found me on my front porch with Elmer, 2 old men sitting side by side, sipping cold beers while the neighborhood slipped into its weekend rhythm. The police tape was gone now. The reporters had drifted off to chase fresher stories, and Riverside had settled back into its quiet, comfortable routines. But beneath the calm surface, my life, my family had been altered in ways no one could see from the street. "Court called this morning," I said, breaking the silence. The beer was cold, refreshing against the late afternoon sun, but the news I carried felt heavy. Gary got 5 years probation, restitution of every cent he tried to take, and 500 hours of community service. Judge said the family nature of the crime was an aggravating factor, not a mitigating one. Elmer let out a low whistle, nodding in approval. "Sounds about right to me. What about that other fellow, Raines? 2 years in county." Judge wasn't nearly as forgiving with him, being a repeat offender and all. I took another swallow, eyes drifting across the street where the empty curb in front of Mrs. Henderson's house reminded me of the truck that had started this whole nightmare. Funny thing was, I almost felt sorry for Gary. Almost. Elmer leaned back, resting his can on the porch rail. "Almost counts for something, Wilbur. Means you're still his father, even after all he's done." We let the silence stretch after that. The kind of silence that feels comfortable because words aren't needed. Elmer had gone from neighbor to friend in the span of a few harrowing days. He'd done more than protect my house. He'd stood guard over my peace of mind when I hadn't even known it was in danger. "I keep thinking about that Tuesday morning," Elmer said at last, his gaze fixed on the Henderson place. "Something about that truck didn't sit right. Too still, too pointed, like watching a man case a house in broad daylight." "Your instincts were dead on," I admitted. "If you hadn't paid attention, if you hadn't called when you did." I trailed off, shaking my head. The safe in my basement held the savings of 40 years, my entire retirement, my last safeguard against a future of uncertainty. If that had been taken, I couldn't even finish the thought. "Well, it's still there," Elmer said firmly, nodding toward my house. "That's what matters. And now you know your security holds strong. That old safe of your father's, it proved its worth." He wasn't wrong. Just yesterday, I'd spent the better part of the day upgrading the locks, adding motion sensors, and reinforcing the windows, not because I was paranoid, because I had learned the hard way that once trust is broken, it takes more than hope to rebuild it. It takes vigilance. "Heard from Hetty yesterday," I said quietly. Elmer turned to me, eyebrows raised. "She's filing for divorce. Says she can't stay married to a man who'd victimize his own family for gambling money." Elmer gave a slow nod, his expression grave but unsurprised. "Smart woman. She looked like she was trapped in something she never signed up for." "Any word if Gary's getting help?" "Court-mandated counseling's part of his probation," I shrugged. "Whether it sticks, that's up to him now. I can't fix him, and I can't keep enabling him, bailing him out every time he digs his own grave." The sun was warm on my face, the kind of late afternoon glow that makes you forget for a moment how dark things can get. For the first time in days, I felt myself relax. The crisis had passed, justice had been dealt, and though trust leaves scars when it shatters, life still moved forward. "You know the strangest part of all this," I said, half to myself. "That dinner Wednesday night, sitting there watching Gary and Hetty act their parts like performers on stage. Everything rehearsed, everything too neat. I knew something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it." "Parental instincts," Elmer replied. "You raised that boy. You know when he's genuine, and when he's not. Problem was, you wanted to believe him. Wanted it bad enough that you looked past what was right in front of you." "Exactly." I leaned forward, setting my empty can on the table between us. "I wanted to believe so badly that I ignored the truth. Won't make that mistake again." "Doesn't mean you stop hoping," Elmer said. "Just means you start hoping with your eyes open." As the evening settled in, the neighborhood began to stir with familiar weekend life. Mrs. Henderson waved from her garden. The Johnson kids zipped past on bicycles, their laughter ringing like bells through the still air. I realized then that what Gary had tried to steal wasn't just money. It was this ordinary, irreplaceable peace, the comfort of aging in place, surrounded by neighbors who cared, the assurance that even when family failed you, community could hold you up. "Thank you, Elmer," I said, my voice steady, carrying the full weight of what I meant. "For trusting your instincts, for watching my back, for being the kind of neighbor everyone should have." He smiled, pride and warmth shining through. "That's what neighbors do, Wilbur. We watch out for each other. Besides," he gestured toward the empty curb where Otis's truck had once lurked, "felt good to put these old army observation skills to work again." The sun dipped lower, spilling gold across the rooftops, painting the world in the soft light of endings and beginnings. Tomorrow would bring whatever storms it chose, but tonight I was where I belonged, on my front porch, beside a friend who had proven himself when it mattered most, in a neighborhood that had shown its true colors when tested. Justice had been served, community had endured, and trust, though scarred, still had a place, rebuilt piece by piece, between people who had earned it. I crouched low among Hetty's tulips, my breath ragged, my pulse hammering in my ears. The scent of damp soil rose around me, thick and earthy, and for a moment I simply stayed still, letting the cool night air cut through the panic pressing at my chest. Above me, the bathroom window gaped like a wound in the side of the house, a reminder of the betrayal festering inside. My son's voice, my own flesh and blood, drifted faintly through the opening, sharp, panicked, demanding. Hetty's softer tones answered in clipped whispers, fear coiling tight in every syllable. They thought I was trapped. They thought age had dulled my instincts and my will, but I had more left in me than either of them imagined. I moved carefully through the flower bed, ignoring the way wet soil clung to my knees and jacket. My shoes sank slightly into the grass as I edged toward the back gate, each step deliberate, every muscle alive with tension. The wooden fence loomed ahead, old but sturdy, and beyond it, the alley stretched like a dark artery through the neighborhood. Somewhere not far off, laughter carried from a porch, the oblivious sound of ordinary life continuing while mine collapsed. I paused at the fence, pressing my palm against the rough boards. For the briefest moment, I thought of Gary as a boy, 5 years old, chasing fireflies in this very yard, his laughter bright as the summer sky. I thought of the scraped knees I'd patched, the stories I'd read him at night, the way he used to fall asleep, clutching my hand like it was his anchor. And then I thought of the man he'd become, the gambler, the liar, the stranger who had locked me in a house and delivered mine to thieves. A coldness took root in me, deeper and sharper than any grief. I climbed. The wood bit into my palms, and my joints screamed with effort, but rage steadied me. I hauled myself over, landing in the alley with a grunt, my breath tearing from my lungs. I straightened, brushing dirt from my jacket, and looked back at the house that no longer felt like home but like a prison. A shadow crossed the upstairs window, and for a heartbeat I feared Gary had seen me. But no alarm followed, no shout. Not yet. The night wrapped around me as I moved down the alley, my mind a storm of thoughts. They had stripped me of dignity, of security, of the illusion that blood was thicker than greed, but they had not stripped me of will. And as I walked into the darkness, one truth burned brighter than all the rest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't let myself pause in the alley for long. The cold night air tasted like resolve. My legs were stiff and aching, my jacket scratched from the climb, but every bruise and every ache felt like proof that I was still capable of action, that I could still move when it mattered. I tucked the photograph of Gary at 12 into my inner pocket, the one that had steadied me in the patrol car the night the police arrived, and I started walking toward the house in a direction that kept me out of sight of the front windows. My plan was simple and old-fashioned: gather facts, tighten the net, and let the law do the rest. It wasn't vengeance in the cinematic sense, no dramatic confrontations in a dark warehouse, but it was thorough, practical, and it would leave no room for the excuses Gary loved to hide behind. I'd spent a lifetime solving problems by the clock and by the book. Now was no time to abandon that habit. Elmer was the first person I called, because he'd already proven he saw what others missed. He answered on the second ring, voice hoarse from his vigil. "You okay?" he asked. "No," I said, and he knew the tone. "But I will be. I'm at the corner. Stay where you are. Call Miller and tell him I'm on my way back. Don't say a thing about me being outside. You want me to lie to an officer?" Elmer's chuckle was stiff. "Not lie. Just hold your place," I said. "Don't move." By the time I reached my porch, police lights were still a thin glow on the horizon around some of the other streets, the tail end of the response. I let myself in through the side door the officers had used, the kitchen smelling faintly of the traces Otis had left, sweat and the metallic tang of tools. Inside, everything looked exactly like it had the night before, except for the evidence markers and the faint dust where someone had tried to pry open the safe. I called Officer Miller from my landline. When he came, he moved with the easy competence of someone who'd seen the worst and stayed sane. "You all right, Mr. Porter?" he asked. I told him about the open bathroom window and how Gary had planted himself in the doorway. I told him what I'd seen at Hetty's window and how Gary's watch had told a different story from his words. I handed over the details, the license plate, the description of the truck, Otis's half-confession about payment, and Miller listened with the attention of a man who knew how small details become the backbone of a case. "We'll tie these together," he said. "With what Raines gave us, and your statement, we can move on probable cause for more than a simple burglary." His voice had a businesslike warmth that calmed me more than any counselor's platitude could have. Days blurred into depositions and interviews. I gave my statements, sat through the dull theater of paperwork, signed forms that felt like talismans, subpoenas, affidavits, witness statements. I offered what I had: names, times, the memory of a watch check, the oddness of the truck, and watched the detectives knit them with what they'd pulled from Otis's confessions and the small practical evidence found in my basement. When the officers executed the search warrant at Gary's house and found the crumpled receipts, the ledger of loan payments, the photographs of stacks of money promised and never paid, I felt a faint cold relief. It was proof, ugly and real. There was no longer space for excuses that had once let me look away. The court process became another kind of fieldwork: hearings, the judge's clipped voice, the measured language of law. The prosecutor treated the case like a ladder. Each rung was another charge, another document, another witness. I sat in the courtroom and watched Gary move through his own theater of self-defense, watching him try to charm the judge the way he once tried to charm me over steak and wine. He still hadn't learned the one infallible truth: actions leave traces, paper trails, witnesses, time-stamped receipts, people who remember. Hetty's divorce filing came as no surprise. She had spent too long between a man and his appetites, and the bills had become more than money. They were proof that what held him together was a web of lies. Watching her sign those papers at the attorney's office, shoulders squared despite her pale face, I felt nothing like glee. There was humility more than triumph in the sight. Her voice, when she corroborated the timeline, was quiet and steady. She had crossed a line I couldn't have made her cross, and for that she had my guarded respect. Otis took his sentence and left with the expression of a man who'd traded one set of debts for another. Gary's probation, restitution, and community service were public records now, a tally of consequences that would show up in job applications and in bar complaints and in back alleys where men like him used to crow. The judge's words that the betrayal of family was an aggravating factor sat like a stone in my chest, not because I wanted him punished, but because the law had spoken where I could not. There were practical things to attend to after the adrenaline faded. I upgraded the safe anchoring, rewired deadbolts to latch from the inside automatically, installed cameras that fed into a small monitor that sat like an intrusion-proof eye by my armchair. I learned the layout of my house again the way a scout relearns a trail after a wildfire. I reconnected with neighbors and with friends I'd let drift. They returned those loans of trust like currency, small favors and late-night checks that stitched back community in thin, steady threads. The hardest work, though, was living with a son who had once been a small boy with grease-stained hands and a fierce pride in a job well done. The man who sat in the back of a patrol car and later in a probation office was the same boy in name and DNA, but the distance between him and me had become wide as a field after harvest. There are things you reconcile. There are things you do not. I chose boundaries. I chose a life where consequence was not a tool of cruelty, but a teacher with a heavy hand. Friends asked if I felt vindicated. I told them no. Vindication implies joy in another's fall. What I felt was steadiness, the return of agency. I had been used, and I'd repaired the damage. That was all. It was enough. Yet every so often, when dusk settled and the house sighed in the way old houses do, a cold ember of something darker would flare. The thought of how easily a man could betray his blood sat in the pit of me like an ache. I found myself imagining small private justice, letters to those who had loaned Gary money, a quiet call to a few of the collectors ensuring they knew the situation, a careful relocation of accounts to protect what remained. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just the slow, deliberate closing of doors. People asked if I would ever speak to Gary again. Time would tell. For now, the porch had become my courtroom and my sanctuary. I sat there many nights with Elmer's company, watching the neighborhood breathe and heal. We mended fences literally and figuratively. We planted new flowers in Hetty's emptied bed and removed the bent screen from the bathroom that had been my escape route, sealing that chapter with a new pain. If revenge had once burned inside me like dry straw, it was now a contained fire,
used to warm, not to consume. I chose to let the law and truth do the heavy lifting, but I also chose to guard what remained. The quiet dusk on my porch, the honest nod from a neighbor, the steady creak of the house that remembered better times. I would not pretend the hurt had vanished. It had only changed shape. I carried it, like a scar carries a story, and with it the knowledge that when someone tries to take your life piece by piece, you have the right, the duty, to put the pieces back together and stand in the middle of what you've rebuilt.
I climbed. The wood bit into my palms, and my joints screamed with effort, but rage steadied me. I hauled myself over, landing in the alley with a grunt, my breath tearing from my lungs. I straightened, brushing dirt from my jacket, and looked back at the house that no longer felt like home but like a prison. A shadow crossed the upstairs window, and for a heartbeat I feared Gary had seen me. But no alarm followed, no shout. Not yet. The night wrapped around me as I moved down the alley, my mind a storm of thoughts. They had stripped me of dignity, of security, of the illusion that blood was thicker than greed. But they had not stripped me of will, and as I walked into the darkness, one truth burned brighter than all the rest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I didn't let myself pause in the alley for long. The cold night air tasted like resolve. My legs were stiff and aching, my jacket scratched from the climb, but every bruise and every ache felt like proof that I was still capable of action, that I could still move when it mattered. I tucked the photograph of Gary at 12 into my inner pocket, the one that had steadied me in the patrol car the night the police arrived, and I started walking toward the house in a direction that kept me out of sight of the front windows. My plan was simple and old-fashioned. Gather facts, tighten the net, and let the law do the rest. It wasn't vengeance in the cinematic sense, no dramatic confrontations in a dark warehouse, but it was thorough, practical, and it would leave no room for the excuses Gary loved to hide behind. I'd spent a lifetime solving problems by the clock and by the book. Now was no time to abandon that habit. Elmer was the first person I called, because he'd already proven he saw what others missed. He answered on the second ring, voice hoarse from his vigil. "You okay?" he asked. "No," I said, and he knew the tone. "But I will be. I'm at the corner. Stay where you are. Call Miller and tell him I'm on my way back. Don't say a thing about me being outside." "You want me to lie to an officer?" Elmer's chuckle was stiff. "Not lie. Just hold your place," I said. "Don't move." By the time I reached my porch, police lights were still a thin glow on the horizon around some of the other streets, the tail end of the response. I let myself in through the side door the officers had used, the kitchen smelling faintly of the traces Otis had left, sweat and the metallic tang of tools. Inside, everything looked exactly like it had the night before, except for the evidence markers and the faint dust where someone had tried to pry open the safe. I called Officer Miller from my landline. When he came, he moved with the easy competence of someone who'd seen the worst and stayed sane. "You all right, Mr. Porter?" he asked. I told him about the open bathroom window and how Gary had planted himself in the doorway. I told him what I'd seen at Hetty's window and how Gary's watch had told a different story from his words. I handed over the details, the license plate, the description of the truck, Otis's half-confession about payment, and Miller listened with the attention of a man who knew how small details become the backbone of a case. "We'll tie these together," he said. "With what Raines gave us, and your statement, we can move on probable cause for more than a simple burglary." His voice had a business-like warmth that calmed me more than any counselor's platitude could have. Days blurred into depositions and interviews. I gave my statements, sat through the dull theater of paperwork, signed forms that felt like talismans, subpoenas, affidavits, witness statements. I offered what I had: names, times, the memory of a watch check, the oddness of the truck, and watched the detectives knit them with what they'd pulled from Otis's confessions and the small practical evidence found in my basement. When the officers executed the search warrant at Gary's house and found the crumpled receipts, the ledger of loan payments, the photographs of stacks of money promised and never paid, I felt a faint, cold relief. It was proof, ugly and real. There was no longer space for excuses that had once let me look away. The court process became another kind of fieldwork. Hearings, the judge's clipped voice, the measured language of law. The prosecutor treated the case like a ladder. Each rung was another charge, another document, another witness. I sat in the courtroom and watched Gary move through his own theater of self-defense, watching him try to charm the judge the way he once tried to charm me over steak and wine. He still hadn't learned the one infallible truth. Actions leave traces, paper trails, witnesses, time-stamped receipts, people who remember. Hetty's divorce filing came as no surprise. She had spent too long between a man and his appetites, and the bills had become more than money. They were proof that what held him together was a web of lies. Watching her sign those papers at the attorney's office, shoulders squared despite her pale face, I felt nothing like glee. There was humility more than triumph in the sight. Her voice when she corroborated the timeline was quiet and steady. She had crossed a line I couldn't have made her cross, and for that she had my guarded respect. Otis took his sentence, and left with the expression of a man who'd traded one set of debts for another. Gary's probation, restitution, and community service were public records now, a tally of consequences that would show up in job applications, and in bar complaints and in back alleys where men like him used to crow. The judge's words that the betrayal of family was an aggravating factor sat like a stone in my chest, not because I wanted him punished, but because the law had spoken where I could not. There were practical things to attend to after the adrenaline faded. I upgraded the safe anchoring, rewired deadbolts to latch from the inside automatically, installed cameras that fed into a small monitor that sat like an intrusion-proof eye by my armchair. I learned the layout of my house again the way a scout relearns a trail after a wildfire. I reconnected with neighbors, and with friends I'd let drift. They returned those loans of trust like currency, small favors and late-night checks that stitched back community in thin, steady threads. The hardest work, though, was living with a son who had once been a small boy with grease-stained hands and a fierce pride in a job well done. The man who sat in the back of a patrol car, and later in a probation office, was the same boy in name and DNA, but the distance between him and me had become wide as a field after harvest. There are things you reconcile. There are things you do not. I chose boundaries. I chose a life where consequence was not a tool of cruelty, but a teacher with a heavy hand. Friends asked if I felt vindicated. I told them no. Vindication implies joy in another's fall. What I felt was steadiness, the return of agency. I had been used, and I'd repaired the damage. That was all. It was enough. Yet every so often, when dusk settled, and the house sighed in the way old houses do, a cold ember of something darker would flare. The thought of how easily a man could betray his blood sat in the pit of me like an ache. I found myself imagining small private justice, letters to those who had loaned Gary money, a quiet call to a few of the collectors, ensuring they knew the situation, a careful relocation of accounts to protect what remained. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just the slow, deliberate closing of doors. People asked if I would ever speak to Gary again. Time would tell. For now the porch had become my courtroom and my sanctuary. I sat there many nights with Elmer's company, watching the neighborhood breathe and heal. We mended fences literally and figuratively. We planted new flowers in Hetty's emptied bed, and removed the bent screen from the bathroom that had been my escape route, sealing that chapter with a new pain. If revenge had once burned inside me like dry straw, it was now a contained fire, used to warm, not to consume. I chose to let the law and truth do the heavy lifting, but I also chose to guard what remained: the quiet dusk on my porch, the honest nod from a neighbor, the steady creak of the house that remembered better times. I would not pretend the hurt had vanished. It had only changed shape. I carried it, like a scar carries a story, and with it the knowledge that when someone tries to take your life piece by piece, you have the right, the duty, to put the pieces back together and stand in the middle of what you've rebuilt.